$315 trillion. That number is not a typo. 315 trillion. That is the total amount of debt in the world right now, confirmed by the Institute of International Finance in their Global Debt Monitor. For context, the entire planet produces roughly $100 trillion of goods and services in a year. So the world owes more than 3 times its own annual output. The math is not complicated. The world borrowed more than it can ever produce in 3 consecutive years combined, and it owes that money every single year. But here's the question nobody asks out loud. If everyone owes money, who exactly do they owe it to? Governments owe, corporations owe, households owe, emerging markets owe, developed nations owe. The United States, with its $36 trillion national debt, owes. Japan, carrying a debt load equal to 236% of its entire economy, owes. The European Union owes, China owes, everyone owes. So somewhere, somehow, on the other side of this ledger, someone is receiving. Someone is on the winning end of the greatest debt mountain in the history of human civilization. The question is, who? And the deeper question is whether anyone designed this system deliberately, or whether it just grew this way on its own. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a mechanics lesson. Before we go further, hit subscribe if you have not already. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you actually know who holds the debt before you clicked on this video? I read every single response. Everything I am about to show you is on the public record. The numbers come from the International Monetary Fund's Global Debt Monitor, the Congressional Budget Office's Fiscal Year 2025 Summary, the Federal Reserve's own published archives, and the Bank of England's official history. You can verify every figure yourself at imf.org, at cbo.gov, and at bankofengland.co.uk. These are not my numbers, they are theirs. In the next 23 minutes, I am going to break down 4 specific moments in history that built the architecture of the debt system you live inside right now. By the end of this video, you will understand why government debt was engineered from its very beginning to be permanent rather than temporary. You will see how a single courier's midnight ride in 1815 still shapes the bond market you participate in today. You will understand why Japan at 236% debt continues functioning while other countries at the same ratio collapse. And you will know what the data suggests that sophisticated institutional investors are actually doing inside this system rather than trying to escape it. Let us begin. Here is what the textbooks skip. In the summer of 1694, England was not simply struggling financially. England was existentially broke. King William III had been fighting France for years, and the treasury was empty. Previous kings had destroyed the credit markets entirely. In 1672, Charles II had borrowed heavily from London's goldsmiths, and then simply decided, because he was king, that he did not need to pay them back. Goldsmith businesses collapsed. Trust evaporated. By the time William needed money for his wars, not a single serious lender in England would extend the crown so much as a shilling. A Scottish merchant named William Paterson had a solution. No statues were ever built of him. No national holiday marks his birthday. The Bank of England's own museum is not entirely certain where he is buried. But what Paterson proposed in a series of meetings beginning in 1691 and finally implemented 3 years later would reshape the financial destiny of every human being alive on Earth today. His plan was deceptively elegant. Gather wealthy private investors, have them pool their capital, specifically £1.2 million, and lend it to the government. In return, the government would pay 8% interest per year, funded through direct taxation on the people. And here is the kicker. The principal would never have to be repaid. The state would pay interest forever, not a loan to be settled in full, a debt to be serviced in perpetuity. Paterson himself reportedly described the innovation this way. The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies, which it creates out of nothing. Whether his exact words or a paraphrase, the concept was precise. Parliament approved it. On the 27th of July, 1694, the Bank of England received its royal charter. Its initial £1.2 million target, fully subscribed in just 11 days by 1,268 investors from across English society. Britain's national debt went from £1.2 million that summer to £16 million just 4 years later. By 1815, it stood at £850 million. By the end of the 20th century, it had never been repaid. It had never been intended to be repaid. But here's what Paterson actually invented that day in 1694. Before that charter, debt was debt. You borrowed money, you paid it back. The obligation ended. After that charter, government debt became something structurally different. It became the raw material for creating money itself. The government's promise to pay interest became the foundation for issuing currency. The more the government borrowed, the more money could exist in circulation. Debt and money became two sides of the same instrument. The Bank of England has been called the mother of all central banks. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Reserve Bank of Australia. Virtually every modern central institution now operates on the blueprint that Patterson created in the summer of 1694. The system was not designed to eventually eliminate government debt. The system was designed from its very first day to make permanent government debt the engine of financial civilization. Check. Verified. Undeniable. The critical difference from today's situation, Britain's 17th century debt was owed primarily to domestic investors who were also politically aligned with the state. Today's debt is globally distributed, creating a dependency that no single government fully controls. Bull case. Permanent debt creates permanent stability because institutional investors always need sovereign paper to anchor their portfolios. Bear case. When interest payments outgrow tax revenue growth, the engine stalls regardless of how well-designed the architecture is. The evening of June 18, 1815. Somewhere in the darkness outside Brussels, 67,000 British, Dutch, and German troops under the Duke of Wellington were locked in the most consequential engagement of a generation. Napoleon Bonaparte's French army was attempting its final push for European dominance. Bond markets in London had been volatile for days, priced on uncertainty. If Napoleon won, British consuls would collapse. If Wellington held, they would surge. London did not know, but a Rothschild agent stationed near the battlefield was already moving. Using a private network of relay riders, Rothschild ships, and an intelligence infrastructure that outpaced every government on the continent, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, the London head of the Rothschild banking dynasty, received confirmed news of Wellington's victory fully 48 hours before Wellington's own official dispatch reached the British cabinet. Historian Niall Ferguson, who examined the Rothschild family archives directly, confirmed that the couriers did in fact arrive first. What Nathan did with that information was not the legend of malicious manipulation that later propaganda would invent. It was something more calculated and ultimately more consequential. He had actually bet heavily on a long war, stockpiling gold to finance Wellington's supply lines. A sudden peace meant the gold reserves he had built up were suddenly excess. His exposure was enormous. The victory that should have been good news was, for a banker positioned for extended conflict, a near disaster. Nathan's exit was the bond market. On July 20th, 1815, the evening edition of the London Courier reported that Nathan had made what it called great purchases of stock, meaning British government bonds. He used his early information not to crash prices and buy at the bottom, but to make a massive and historically unprecedented bet on the long-term creditworthiness of a victorious Britain. He held those positions for months. The Rothschild family's collective assets roughly doubled in the following year. But the deeper consequence was architectural, not personal. Within 3 years, Nathan arranged a £5 million loan to the Prussian government. He financed post-Napoleonic reconstruction across multiple sovereigns. By the early 1820s, the Rothschild network was, in practical terms, the unofficial lender of last resort to European civilization. The message embedded in those transactions was permanent. Sovereign debt was not merely a government instrument. Whoever controlled access to sovereign debt markets controlled the cost of war, the cost of peace, and ultimately, the price at which nations could function. The secondary bond market, the infrastructure through which pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and individual investors worldwide now participate in government debt, was built in this period. You are inside that structure right now. Check, verified, undeniable. Now here's the part that central banks do not teach. Just before Thanksgiving in 1910, 6 men boarded a private railroad car at a terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey, with the window shades drawn against the November night. They used only first names, Nelson, Harry, Frank, Paul, Pyatt, and Arthur, to prevent the car's staff from recognizing them. The cover story was a duck hunting expedition. One member had even borrowed a shotgun he did not know how to fire, simply to maintain the appearance. They were heading to Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private retreat founded in 1886 whose membership included J.P. Morgan, Marshall Field, and William Kissam Vanderbilt. Munsey's magazine had described it 4 years earlier as the richest, most exclusive, most inaccessible club in the world. JP. Morgan himself had likely arranged the group's access to the club's facilities. According to the Federal Reserve's own official history, the 6 men were Senator Nelson Aldrich, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee, Piet Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Davison, a senior partner at JP. Morgan, Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, now known as Citibank, Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's private secretary, and Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn Loeb and the most technically sophisticated banking mind in the group. For 9 days, they drafted the plan that would become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The meeting was so tightly controlled that its participants denied it had taken place until the 1930s. Frank Vanderlip eventually wrote in his 1935 autobiography, "I do not feel it is an exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve." What they created was a mechanism by which the United States Treasury could borrow money in perpetuity through a central bank that would purchase government bonds and use them as the basis for currency creation. The Patterson logic, scaled to the world's emerging dominant economy, unlimited sovereign borrowing, institutionalized. By December 23, 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, the architecture first drawn in 1694 had been embedded into the financial system of the country that would spend the 20th century becoming the world's reserve power. Check, verified, undeniable, quick thing. This channel exists to break down the mechanics of how power actually works, not the surface narrative, but the architecture underneath. Subscribe if you want to follow this story as it develops. Now back to 1979. The fourth architect did not build the original system. He extended it to include the entire developing world. August of 1979, Paul Volcker was newly appointed as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Inflation in the United States was running above 11% annually. His solution was operationally brutal and historically unprecedented. Raise short-term interest rates until inflation broke, regardless of the collateral damage. U.S. short-term rates climbed from 9.5% in August 1979 to more than 16% by May 1981. But here is what they are not telling you in the standard economic textbooks. Here is what that meant for every developing country that had borrowed dollars during the 1970s. Through that decade, petrodollars, the surplus earnings of oil-exporting nations deposited in large Western commercial banks, had been recycled as loans to Latin American and African governments. The terms seemed attractive. Rates were low, dollars were abundant, and global growth made repayment appear achievable. Mexico borrowed. Brazil borrowed. Argentina borrowed. The logic was straightforward. Borrow at low floating rates, invest in infrastructure and industry, repay over time. Volcker's rate decision changed that arithmetic permanently and catastrophically. Almost all of those external debts were denominated in US dollars at floating rates, meaning they repriced automatically whenever US interest rates moved. When American rates doubled, then nearly tripled, the interest burden on developing country debt exploded overnight. Countries that had planned their budgets around 7 or 8% borrowing costs now faced rates approaching 20% on the same principle. In August of 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer service its external debt. The global sovereign debt crisis ignited. Argentina followed. Brazil followed. Across Latin America and beyond, the same mechanism played out simultaneously. The Volcker shock had turned manageable debt into mathematical impossibility. What followed defined the terms of development finance for the next generation. The International Monetary Fund stepped in, but not as a rescuer offering forgiveness. It entered as a restructurer offering rescheduling. Countries were offered extended repayment schedules in exchange for adopting the Washington Consensus. Privatize state assets, liberalize trade, cut public spending, maintain the dollar-denominated debt. The Brady bonds of 1989 converted renegotiated Latin American debts into tradable securities. Countries that had been in default were reintegrated into global capital markets, still owing, but now in a form that Wall Street could buy and sell. The debt did not disappear. It was converted, extended, and absorbed into the international financial architecture. The IMF's own historians have described the decade that followed for Latin America as a lost decade of development. Countries not under IMF pressure during this period, particularly in East Asia, maintained policy autonomy, invested in export manufacturing, and grew their way into the 21st century as creditors rather than perpetual debtors. The divergence between those two paths is not a mystery. It is a predictable consequence of who was inside the debt architecture and who maintained distance from it. Check, verified, undeniable. So we have 4 architects across 3.5 centuries. Patterson made government debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made sovereign debt markets inescapable in 1815. Jekyll Island scaled the mechanism to the world's reserve currency in 1913. Volcker extended it to the developing world in 1982. The result, as of the end of 2024, is $318 trillion in global debt. Nearly $7 trillion was added in 2024 alone, according to the Institute of International Finance. That is the annual production of the entire Japanese economy added to the global debt stack in a single year. Back to the original question, who collects? If you are still with me, smash the like button. Tell me in the comments, were you taught any of this in school? I read every comment, and your perspectives genuinely shape what we cover next. Now here is the part most people never see. Here is the concrete answer. In fiscal year 2025, the United States government paid more than $1 trillion in net interest on its public debt. The Congressional Budget Office's fiscal year 2025 final summary, published after September 30th, 2025, confirms this explicitly. Interest payments on the public debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time in American history. That is more than total U.S. defense spending. That is more than the entire federal spending on Medicare. It is interest, only interest, none of the principal. The Treasury Department's own data breaks down the recipients. As of end of 2024, approximately 32% of U.S. debt held by the public is owned by foreign investors, totaling approximately $9.1 trillion. The three largest foreign holders by country are Japan at roughly $1.1 trillion, China at approximately $800 billion, and the United Kingdom at approximately $700 billion. Though much of that UK figure reflects London's role as a custodial hub for international investors rather than British domestic demand. Domestically, the Federal Reserve holds the largest single block of Treasury securities, though it has been reducing those holdings since 2022. Beyond the Fed, the largest pools of domestic capital are channeled through mutual funds, pension funds, and the world's largest asset managers. BlackRock manages approximately $10 trillion in total assets, a significant proportion of which is in fixed income, including U.S. Treasuries. Vanguard operates at a similar scale. These institutions are not abstract villains. They are the conduits through which the retirement savings, pension accounts, and insurance policies of ordinary Americans have been systematically invested back into the government debt machine. The circuit is circular and self-reinforcing. The government borrows, it pays interest. That interest flows to domestic and foreign holders, central banks, pension funds, and asset managers. Those institutions reinvest the proceeds. The government borrows again to fund the next year's spending gap. The architecture ensures the cycle continues. Consider what $1 trillion in annual interest actually represents. In fiscal year 2025, total U.S. government revenue was approximately $5.2 trillion. Interest consumed roughly 19 cents of every dollar the government collected in taxes. If you earn $60,000 per year and pay an effective federal tax rate of approximately 20%, your total federal contribution is around $12,000. Of that $12,000, approximately $2,280 goes purely to servicing debt obligations. Not roads, not teachers, not research, not healthcare. Interest on the architecture that Patterson, Rothschild, and Jekyll Island built 330 years ago. If you are thinking right now, okay, but Japan has 236% debt to GDP, and it has not collapsed, so clearly the debt system can sustain itself indefinitely. That is a legitimate observation. And the answer reveals exactly how the architecture operates. Here is the structural difference. Japan's debt is almost entirely owed to itself. As of the end of 2024, approximately 88% of Japanese government bonds are held domestically, split between the Bank of Japan, domestic insurance companies, and domestic banks. Japan is effectively writing itself an enormous internal IOU. The interest it pays circulates within the Japanese economy. The principal risk of a sudden withdrawal by foreign creditors does not meaningfully apply. Japanese bonds have resisted yield pressure for decades, precisely because the domestic holders have no other viable market to exit into at comparable scale. The United States has a fundamentally different creditor structure. 32% external ownership means that U.S. Treasury yields are set not by Washington, but by a global market where foreign central banks can signal reduced demand and move yields within hours. The U.S. benefits from reserve currency status, which is itself the mechanism that allows the debt to grow without immediate market punishment. But that reserve status is not a permanent condition. It is a confidence-based arrangement between the dollar and its holders. When that confidence shifts, the insulation disappears. The second difference is currency denomination. Japan's debt is almost entirely yen-denominated. Japan cannot face the 1982 scenario, where a foreign interest rate shock reprices its entire debt stock overnight. The US dollar's reserve status provides a similar insulation domestically, but only for as long as the dollar remains the primary global settlement currency. These are not the same thing. One is structural, the other is contingent. I am not a financial advisor, but here is what the data suggests. Institutional investors operating inside the debt architecture do not attempt to exit the system. They position themselves to benefit from its mechanics while managing its risks. The data on their behavior is publicly available. First, what the data shows about inflation protection. Investors who maintained meaningful allocations to Treasury inflation-protected securities, known as TIPS, during periods when government debt was being managed through inflation rather than repayment, such as the 1970s and the post-2020 period, experienced significantly smaller real terms losses than holders of nominal bonds. The structural reason is that debt monetization, printing money to service interest, flows directly into the consumer price index. TIPS adjust their principal for that inflation automatically. Second, what the data shows about maturity and duration. In environments of elevated interest rates and persistent deficits, shorter duration Treasury instruments have historically preserved capital more effectively than long bonds. When rates rise, long bond prices fall sharply. Institutional allocations tracked during the 2022 to 2025 period show concentrated positions in Treasury bills and short-dated notes rather than 30-year bonds. The losses on long-duration portfolios during this period were among the worst in modern fixed income history. Third, what the data shows about assets beyond the dollar debt structure. Institutional portfolios tracked by major asset managers have steadily increased allocations to real assets, real estate, infrastructure, commodities, and commodity-producing equities. This is not a prediction that the debt system collapses next year. It is a data-backed observation about how institutions with 50-year return horizons position themselves when debt-to-GDP ratios reach historically elevated levels. Fourth, and most importantly, for understanding the system's durability, it is not going to end next Tuesday. The reason permanent sovereign debt has persisted across every period since 1694 is that the institutions benefiting from its continuation, central banks, major asset managers, pension funds, foreign reserve managers all have aligned interests in its stability. Understanding that alignment does not require pessimism, it requires clarity. The system is not maintained because it is optimal. It is maintained because the alternative, a disorderly unwind of $318 trillion of global debt, is worse for everyone who holds any of it. And at this scale, that includes almost everyone. $318 trillion, 4 architects, 3.5 centuries, $1 trillion in annual interest from the United States alone. A mechanism that was designed, in the summer of 1694, to never require the principal to be repaid. Not might, will keep running. The question is not whether the system continues, the question is where you sit within it. Subscribe if you have not already. We are tracking this story as it develops. Thanks for watching.